morning, guys. I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog, and welcome to my studio again for another live lesson. Hopefully this week goes a little bit smoother than last week. I just checked my internet connection speed, and it looks like everything is good to go, and hopefully that doesn't change. And good morning to everyone who's joining me, Sandy, Tess, Ruth, Diana, Brandy. Glad you guys are all here with me today, at least virtually. Uh, as you can see in my little basket, it's still a little bit too early. My partner in crime, Dobby the cat, has not joined me for the day. So she's probably out still prowling around, which I guess is good. So it looks like you guys have been doing some fun projects this week. I know my friend Sandy's working on a really cool shawl, a Wonder Woman shawl. I think she found the pattern on Ravelry. Maybe she can pipe in and let me know. It looked really cool yesterday when I saw her online. Ruth, you've been learning stranded knitting this week. Congratulations. That is a lot of fun to learn how to do. And it's kind of like magic once you get the rhythm of it. So you can make some really, really cool stuff. This week, I have been finishing up a kind of secret project. I have been designing a pattern for a knit along. And it's actually my very first mystery knit along, and it will be starting on July 31st. So make sure to subscribe to my newsletter because that's the first place you're going to see any updates and information about what's happening. But until now, I kind of have to keep it under wraps. This week, we're going to hopefully learn how to fix mistakes in our knitting. And mistakes happen all the time in knitting, and it can be as simple as when you're talking to somebody, sitting around a table and working on a project, and you get going and you lose your count and screw up, or sometimes it can be something a little bit more involved. So today I'm going to hopefully be able to show you a couple of options of things you can do to fix mistakes in your knitting without having to rip back rows and rows and rows of work. So I'm going to switch over to my knitting cam. And last week I talked about it briefly, but everything kind of went haywire. I got a new toy. I'm really excited to give it a try, and hopefully this week things work better than last week. I actually got an arm for my tripod. So now my camera is mounted over my knitting, and hopefully it's a little bit easier for me to work because before, whenever you watched any of my knitting videos, I was actually straddling my tripod, which was kind of a pain in the rear to do. And then anytime I bumped it, I would have to redo the video because my sound would get messed up and the video would be shaking. So hopefully this overhead mount works a little bit better and we'll see how it goes. I'm going to switch over to my camera. If there's any sound problems, let me know right away. It's happened in the past. I think I have it worked out, but let's go over to some knitting and learn how to fix some mistakes. All right, so I have knit up a little swatch here, and it's nothing too terribly exciting. I have some pretty readable stitch patterns. I have a section here done in stockinette stitch, but you can see I made a little mistake right there intentionally. I have another section worked in reverse stockinette and another little oops right there, and then some in seed stitch and another little mistake. So hopefully we have time that we can get to all three of those, and I'll demonstrate what to do. So whenever you're knitting, it's easier to fix mistakes the earlier you catch them. And the easiest kind of mistake to fix is that when you catch it in the same row that you're actually knitting in. And that happens a lot. My friends and I usually, when life is more normal, we get together on Friday afternoons at the local yarn shop and we sit around the table and chit-chat. And more than once, one of us has said, oh my gosh, I got so busy talking or so busy listening that I made a mistake. I'm going to have to rip out my knitting. And it's just annoying. But still, there's nothing better than knitting with friends. So here, I intentionally made a mistake in my stockinette pattern.
And I'm going to have to go back. I don't want to keep going. I don't want to leave that mistake in. It's in the same row that I'm working in. So I'm going to just unknit back to where that mistake happened. And that is called tinking. Test, that never happens. That may never happen to you, that you don't make mistakes. I make mistakes. And I know you're fibbing just a little bit, but that's okay. So the easiest way to fix is when you've caught your mistake early and you just want to go back a few stitches to get back to where the mistake happened so you can move on. So it's called unknitting or tinking or knitting backwards. And tink is just the word knit backwards. So to tink back a few stitches, to unknit those stitches, all you need to do is take your left non-working needle and go through the stitch below the one on your right needle from the front to the back. And once you have that stitch on your left needle, you can pull the right needle out and then pull out the yarn. And again, you're going through the stitch, and it doesn't matter whether it's a knit or a purl that you're undoing. You go through from the front to the back. Once it's on the needle, you can tink or unknit that last stitch. Front to back. Once it's on the needle, pull it out. And one of the reasons we go from the front to the back instead of the back to the front is it does two wonderful, wonderful things for us. The first thing that going through front to back does is it gets that lower stitch on the needle. So it's on our needle before we start pulling anything out, which is great. But more importantly, going through from front to back gives our stitch a standard stitch mount with the right hand leg at the front of the needle and the left hand leg of the stitch at the back. If instead you go through the lower stitch, the stitch below, from the back to the front, and then pull your yarn out, the stitch here is still safely held on your left needle, but the stitch mount is backwards of what's customary. The right hand leg of the stitch here is at the back of the needle, and the left hand leg of the stitch is at the front. So when you get back to that stitch later when you're knitting it, you might notice that something feels funny or looks funny. So I'm going to actually just reposition that stitch now so that the right hand leading leg is at the front, just so it's that standard stitch mount, because that's what I use when I'm knitting. So again, I'm going to go through one more stitch from the front to the back, and there's where my mistake happened. So again, I'm going to go through from the front to the back so that I get the stitch on the needle with the standard stitch mount and then pull it out. And now I would be ready to continue on with my knitting. My mistake has been eliminated, erased, if you will, and you could go on knitting. But instead of going on knitting, I see that I have another mistake in my knitting right here. And again, you could rip back rows and rows to get back to where that one stitch is wrong, but that is just not fun. Who wants to rip out rows and rows needlessly? When instead you can work down a column of stitches, fix the mistake, rework up that column, and only have to deal with 4 or 5 stitches instead of having to rip out rows and rows. And yes, Sandy's right. This is the scary part. The first time you actually try this with your own knitting, it's a little bit terrifying because you're going to see laddering and the yarn is all spread out and you think, oh my God, what have I done? But it's really not that bad. So the first thing you need to do is get your work positioned so that the column that has the mistake is at the tip of your needles, and I happen to be there. I worked across to that point, but you could just as easily slip your stitches to that point, and that would be perfectly fine. And then I'm going to use my safety net here, a little locking stitch marker. These things like totally are save the day when you're working down a column, so that you want to unravel down to where the mistake is, but you don't want to go any further than that. So I'm going to first find where my mistake is, and I'm looking for a stitch that's wearing the wrong hat. And what I mean by that is, we all know as knitters that there's a purl bump for every stitch, and it's either on the front of your work or on the back of your work. Here I'm knitting in stockinette stitch, so I want that purl bump to always be at the back. So I want to find a stitch that's wearing that purl bump as a hat, and I want to change its hat. So I'm looking down, and let me see if I can grab another needle here just to use as a pointer as I go close up. So here is the stitch that's wearing the wrong hat. The purl bump here across the top is at the front, and really the purl bump should be at the back of the work. So that's the stitch that I am dealing with. I am going to put a stitch marker right here through that stitch. And that's going to make it so that my work, as I ladder down the column, won't be able to unravel any farther than that. So I'm going through just the right leg of the stitch that's wearing the wrong hat. And not everybody thinks about their stitches that way, and you probably will, if you see other lessons on fixing mistakes, other people may refer to it differently. It's not wrong, just a different way of thinking. For me, it works to look for that stitch that's wearing the wrong hat. And now, the scary part. I want to take this stitch at the top of the column off of my needle, and I'm going to unwork down to where this stitch marker is. So I'm taking that top stitch of the column off my needle, and then we're going to unravel down just to where my stitch marker is. And it's easy to do, and it looks terrifying because we are not used to seeing that big gap or hole there. The good news is, once I get down to my stitch marker, you can see here I can pull and tug and do whatever I want. It won't unravel past the stitch marker because my stitch marker is holding that in place. And one thing I maybe should have mentioned earlier is that when you're unraveling stuff like this and fixing mistakes, it can be really helpful, especially if you're a beginner, to be working on some sort of flat surface on a table and not just trying to do this in your lap. Things aren't going to get away from you here. I'm not going to drop stuff off my needles or have crazy stuff happening if I'm working on a flat surface. So our next secret weapon after the stitch marker is a crochet hook. You can fix your stitches with knitting needles. You can even use the 2 knitting needles that you're actually knitting with. It can be a little bit cumbersome though. So I actually, whenever possible, I would rather use a crochet hook just because it's a little bit easier to manage my stitches. So let's see if we can zoom in here while this is laying flat on my table. And I am going to go through the stitch that's on the marker from the front of my work to the back of my work. Get it on the crochet hook, and then I'm going to take that stitch marker out. Because I'm going to keep my crochet hook in every stitch here as I work, so I don't have to worry about stuff just magically unraveling any further than it already has. Now I need to get the stitches back worked up this column so that I can start knitting again. When you're fixing a column of knit stitches, it's the easiest thing to manipulate. Purls, you're going to see, are a little bit more cumbersome, a little bit more fiddly, but not impossible. But first, let's do just a column of all knit stitches up. you have your stitch on the needle or on the hook, and you want to bring, let me rephrase that. You have your stitch on the hook. We're going to work up this ladder of loose stitches one at a time from the bottom rung and climb up to the top rung. And we want to bring the yarn through from the purl side of the stitch to the knit side. And in this case, all the knit side is here in the front. So all you have to do is hook that lowest rung of the ladder and then pull it through your stitch. And you can see I made another knit stitch there. So again, I'm going to go up to the next rung, crochet hook under the, and pull that rung through the stitch from the purl side to the knit side. And again, it's just that easy. Find the next rung, go under the rung with my hook, and pull it from the purl side to the knit side. And continue on up this little ladder until you've reached the top. And you would never know there that I had a mistake in my knitting. That's one of the reasons I just love this technique, because it's like erasing your mistakes with yarn. So once you have your last stitch, that top rung is up on your hook, you need to get it mounted back onto your left hand needle. And again, just like when we were tinking, all you have to do is go through the stitch with your left needle from the front to the back to give it that proper stitch mount, and take the stitch, or take the crochet hook out, and voila, magic. So now let's work across and we'll learn how to fix a column of purl stitches where there's a mistake. So let me knit across here a couple stitches. So this is probably going to be my last weekly live lesson for a while, just because everyone is finally, hopefully, at the point they're able to start peeking their heads out of their houses a little bit. But I am going to continue, but it's probably going to be on a more monthly-ish basis, because I enjoy doing this, but every week is a little bit consuming for me. So now we're at the point that I'm at the top of the column where my mistake happened here with my purl stitches. And I'm going to lay my work flat again, and we'll zoom in so that we can look really close at what's happening. And just like before, I am going to look for the stitch that's wearing the wrong hat. So in this case, I want the purl bumps to be on the front. I'm looking for a stitch in this column where the purl bump is at the back. It's wearing the wrong hat. And we'll point to it first of all before I grab it with my instead of having this front where I want it to be, this is my stitch right here, that the top of the stitch is wearing the wrong hat. So again, that's where I'm going to put my stitch markers so that when the scary part happens, that we don't lose our stitches. So I'm going to just hook my stitch marker there, right there on the right hand leg, and then ladder down. So at the top, this is the stitch at the top of my column. I'm going to drop it off my needle, and then the scary part, we're going to just gently pull everything apart. All those stitches come unraveled. It looks horrifying, terrifying. right until we get to the stitch marker. And then once we get to that stitch marker, nothing can unravel any further than that. That stitch marker prevents things from going south on us. So again, you could use your knitting needles to fix. Again, I think it's easier to work with a crochet hook. And I'm actually, in addition, when I'm doing a column of purl stitches like this, I actually am going to use both a crochet hook and a knitting needle. Elizabeth has a great question. Do you think it's possible to do this with fisherman's rib? You can actually use this method for fixing just about anything. In the case today, I'm just showing you how to ladder down a single column and fix the stitches. But yes, you can do it with more complex patterns, and I'll show you here when we get to the seed stitch over here. You can do it with more complex patterns, and you can even ladder down multiple stitches at a time. You can fix cables, you can fix ribbing, you can fix all kinds of things if you're brave enough to do it. And it takes a little bit of practice, totally worth practicing on a swatch before you have to use this in real life. So for a purl stitch to fix it, and again, all of these stitches up this column are going to be purls, so I'm going to do them all the same way. Again, we need to go work up this ladder rung by rung and pull each rung through the stitch below from the purl side to the knit side. And it's like I said, the purls are a little bit more cumbersome to work. Usually if I was doing this in real life, if I had to work up a row of purls, I'd probably turn my work over to the other side and do it as knits, because you saw how quick and easy it was to fix the column of knits. Purls are a little bit more cumbersome, a little bit more thought, I guess. So this time I'm going to bring my crochet hook through. Oh, and Ruth asked, the same principle applies to lace knitting. Yeah, you can do lace and fix mistakes with lace this way too, and it is a little scary, but it can be done. So I'm going to bring my crochet hook under one rung of the ladder and then through my stitch that's held on the marker. Now that my hook is through, I'm going to remove the marker. And again, I'm going to use my knitting needle to kind of help me here as a little assist, because it's not quite as easy to do this as it was with the knits. The first thing you need to do is bring your rung over your stitch, because we need to pull this rung through from the purl side to the knit side. And then I'm going to put my needle through. I can use my hook to pull it through from the purl side to the knit side. And you can see everything's fixed there, but now we need to continue working up the rung. So I'm going to hold the stitch on my knitting needle, going through from front to back. The hook goes under one rung and then through the stitch from the back to the front. Pull the rung over the top of the stitch. Use your needle to hold the stitch open and then pull that yarn through from the purl side to the knit side. And you can see it's a little bit more manipulation here. So hold the stitch in place with your knitting needle, go under the next rung and through the stitch with the crochet hook. Bring the rung over the top of the stitch and then pull the rung through with the hook. So there's a few more steps there to do. The rung goes over and then through. Over and then through, and over and then through. And again, now that I have my stitch here, I've worked all the way up the column. Now I just need to get this stitch back onto my left hand needle. And just like when we were tinking, even though my hook here is facing a different direction, I'm going to go through that stitch from the front to the back to give it that standard stitch mount, and then get my hook out. And then we're ready to move on. So it looks like I might have had a little tension problem here. It's not quite as smooth as I did with the knits. But with practice, and when you're not doing it, you know, in front of people, you can get a little bit better results. So now I have one more mistake here that's in a column that has both knits and purls. So let's work across to that. And then that's the tricky one, but still very doable. And I mean, you could, like I said, you can do this in multiple different stitch patterns. And even though it takes a few seconds or a few minutes to go down, just think of if you were working a large project, think of how much time you would save instead of having to rip out rows and rows of a sweater or rows and rows of a blanket or even a scarf, ripping out rows and rows, depending on how far down your mistake was. It's better to spend your time doing that, to just ladder down a few stitches, than to rip out and have to re-knit all of that. So here's my column where my mistake is. It's right there. So I'm going to zoom in again so we can look up close at that mistake. This is just basic seed stitch that alternates from a knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one across both ways. And again, I'm going to use that stitch marker to mark the stitch that's wearing the wrong hat, that has that purl bump on the wrong side. So here is my stitch that's wearing the wrong hat. There should be a purl bump here at the front, but there's not. So I'm going to put my marker right through that stitch because that's where I need to ladder down to so I can get things fixed up. Lock the marker in place so I don't lose anything when the crazy part starts. Sandy mentions a good point there. It would be really cool if there was a hook or some sort of tool that had a hook on both ends. I don't know that I have seen any of those. The hook I'm using, the crochet hook, this one's kind of cool because it has a hook on one end and a knitting needle on the other, which is helpful, but it would be kind of handy when you're fixing mistakes to have a hook on both ends, especially if you're just going down columns like this. So I have my marker on the stitch that's wearing the wrong hat, and at the top of the needle, that's a stitch we need to drop off and ladder down. Then the scary part, and again, you can't ladder down any further once it hits this stitch marker. That's going to stop everything scary from happening. So now we're going to work up a column that has both knits and purls. And again, I'm going to use both my crochet hook and a knitting needle just to make things a little bit easier for me to manage. Again, we're working up rung by rung of the ladder from the bottom rung up to the top to get our stitches back on our needles. And now I need to decide what this stitch that I have held here, what needs to happen next. So the stitch below it is a knit because the purl bump is at the back. So this stitch needs to be wearing a purl bump hat. So the first thing I'm going to do would be just like I was correcting that column of purl stitches. I'm going under one rung of the ladder and then through the stitch. And then once that stitch is on my hook, I can take off the stitch marker. Let's zoom out there a little bit because my camera's not focusing. So first a purl. So just like before, I'm going to use my knitting needle to help me out. I'm going to bring the rung over the stitch and then pull it through from the purl side to the knit side. Oh, and I didn't quite get it through there. And then I'm going to transfer the stitch back to my knitting needle just to hold it. So after the purl, I need a knit just because that's my pattern. So I'm going to go through with my hook from the front to the back. And again, that's the easy one. I can just pull that next rung through just with my crochet hook. And one thing I should mention here, it's really important that you're working the rungs in order. And I checked there, I thought for a minute that I might have done them out of order. So the next stitch is a knit. Again, I'm going to hold the stitch in place with my knitting needle. I'm going to go under the rung. From the back to the front and through the stitch with my hook. Hey Tess, if you're on Knit Picks, are those hooks with the hooks on both ends, do they have a special name? Bring the rung over and pull it through from the front to the back. And again, then I'm going to hold my stitch in place with my knitting needle. The next stitch is a knit. Knits come through from the back to the front. So there's my next rung. Pull it through. Then I'm going to hold the stitch in place. And believe it or not, a couple of weeks ago when I was planning this lesson, before the lesson that went bad on us, I actually did this method and fixed a column of about, and it wasn't that I had necessarily made a mistake. I decided to change a design I was working on. And I actually laddered down about 150 stitches and did this. And it took me about 20 minutes to fix a column of stitches like that. But it was much better than ripping out 150 rows of work. It still was a time saver. And just like before, now that I'm at the top of the column, I just need to get that stitch back onto my left needle. So again, go through from the front to the back. And then continue knitting on. Devoted to knit. Yes, you can flip over from one side to the other, and there's definitely nothing wrong with doing it that way. I've done it that way myself. Sometimes it's a little easier to visualize, but this is a little bit of a time saver. So here's my swatch now. My 3 mistakes are gone. So here was the first one, the second one, the third one, and let's flip things over to the other side just so you can see what happened there as well. And again, I didn't really have too many tension issues. It helps sometimes if you use a hook that is the same size as the needles that you're using, but that's not necessarily mandatory. When I'm out on the go knitting in my little case of supplies, I have a tiny tool. Let me actually show you what I have. And I know some of my friends out there have the same thing. And it's sort of like the needle the hook and needle that I was using, but it is a smaller version. I mean, this is only a couple inches long, and it definitely is smaller than the knitting needles I was working on, but in a pinch, this works really nice to fix mistakes. And Sandy, correct me if I'm wrong, this is called a handy tool. I think that's what it's called. but definitely something that's nice to have when you are on the go.
So guys, I hope that was helpful. So glad it went a lot smoother than last week when the internet gremlins got in our way. I'm really glad all of you joined me today. Thank you so much. I have had so much fun getting to know, at least virtually through chat, a lot of the people that have been watching the videos for the last few weeks. And like I said, I'm not discontinuing them completely, but I am going to try to space them out a little bit more just because it's a lot on me because I still am trying to carry a relatively normal workload, but I don't want to give up this interaction either because I think it's a lot of fun. If you have any ideas for topics you would like me to cover in future live lessons, there's a couple of ways you can let me know about them. After this video is done airing, you can leave a note in the comments about something that you'd like me to teach in the future. Or if you'd like to just get in touch with me directly, you can head over to my website, thechilidog.com. All of my contact information is there. And you can either get a hold of me through email. I love getting people's emails most of the time. And let me know what you'd like to see a lesson on, or send me a message through Instagram or Facebook. I check Instagram more often than I do Facebook. So if you'd like me to respond, just so you know. And I think that's it. I am really looking forward to our mystery knit along in the end of July and working through August. Oh, Diana, what if you forget an increase on the way down? You know what? That might be a good topic for another lesson because that is something that we have all done in the past. And that is also something that you can fix usually without having to rip out rows and rows. So I'm going to put that on my list of ideas for a future lesson. So thank you so much for joining me over the last few weeks. Hopefully things start getting back to normal for all of us in some way, our new normal, which is my least favorite phrase right now, the new normal. And I hope to see you soon. If you are interested in getting updates about both my videos and my knit along, make sure to head over to thechilidog.com. I have a section there that you can subscribe to my newsletter that I send out about once a week, usually Friday mornings. Well, it's Friday mornings here in Tucson, but Fridays. So subscribe to that and we can keep in touch that way. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Get out and enjoy some fresh air, and happy Memorial Day.